Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is Mary Clark. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Syniverse, and I just can't thank you all very much for joining us today. We are very excited to talk about lessons learned implementing VoLTE roaming. So before I get started, I want to cover just a few logistical details. We've muted all of the lines to ensure that we've got a really good, clear experience today. But this is very much designed to be interactive, and will ensure that there's ample time for your questions of our experts after the presentations. So you can either submit your questions in a Q&A panel on the right of your screen, or feel free to tweet a question to @Syniverse using the hashtag #VoLTELessons. We are also recording today's session, and we'll make that available to you along with the copies of the slides in the next few days. So let's go ahead and get rolling. I think if you want to go ahead and move forward, here we go. So we've seen incredible, virtually exponential growth of LTE coverage and penetration, as well as the increased usage of LTE smartphones and devices. And what's happening now is we see the prioritization shifting with the launch of LTE voice services. So what we wanted to do was give you what's the current state. What are we looking at right now in global VoLTE deployments? So this map gives you a pretty good visualization of, if you're in the dark blue, you're still at LTE. If you've moved into the sort of green color, you're moving into VoLTE. So the numbers work out this way. With 442 commercially launched LTE networks in 147 countries, the mobile industry has achieved great success. So we've got 755 million LTE connections as of Q2 2015. Now, mobile operators are making the move to advance the VoLTE market, with 111 operators investing in VoLTE deployments. So there are about 30 operators in 21 countries that have commercially launched VoLTE-based HD voice services. And the GSA announced last month that there are 246 VoLTE-capable devices, including 224 smartphones that have been announced. So it's still important, I think, to level set this. We're talking about 755 million LTE connections when we've got over 6 billion devices globally. So we're still in the early stages of this. I kind of liken it to where we were, talking, VoLTE is about where, I guess, really LTE was about 3 years ago. So we're ramping up, and you can, we know certainly from the conversations we're having with customers that VoLTE is taking over priority, and how is that working? So if you want to go to the next slide, 83% of the carriers that were surveyed by Infonetics say they will deploy VoLTE by 2016, and that 600 million smartphone users worldwide will use VoLTE by 2018. So I think that three-year comparison to sort of where LTE was is probably right in the window there. And the latest reports from Hot Telecom tell us that VoLTE roaming minutes of use will grow by a CAGR of 145% over the next 5 years to reach the 4.7 billion of 2020. So there's clearly market demand. So today what we're going to do is cover what's driving the move to VoLTE, and look at the best practices and the key learnings that you need to be keeping in mind as you're planning your implementations. So today, with the help of our guest speakers, we're going to address that question and share some of the best practices that we have direct experience in working with our customers as we've managed some of the first implementations of VoLTE roaming services. So those have included the world's first transoceanic VoLTE roaming call for U.S. and Japanese operators in March. And then in April, the world's first commercial VoLTE roaming service, giving subscribers of South Korea's LGU Plus the ability to roam onto KDDI in Japan. And then in September, LGU Plus extended its commercial VoLTE roaming for subscribers to the Smart Tone network in Hong Kong, which is also using the Syniverse IPX. But sometimes it's always helpful to get a little bit more perspective about where all of you are. So something you may not have done before in a webinar, we're going to take a little poll. So if we want to go to the next slide, we'll tell you, we're going to ask you two questions. And as you can see on this question, it's not too surprising what we're looking to get your responses on. And we are keeping this completely confidential and are not sharing any of these responses. But we want to get a sense of where are we right now with the audience on this call. And we've got a significant amount of participation today. So the question, if you are planning to launch LTE VoLTE on your home network, what is your timeline? Have you already launched? Next 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 12 months or beyond, or undecided? We're going to give you roughly 30 seconds to answer that question. What we have found in our conversations with customers is certainly that, you know, the emphasis has been on LTE to the extent that the spectrum has been present and there is the infrastructure. But what we're certainly learning is the host of issues that are really totally new, that are over and above what you experienced with LTE for launching VoLTE. So it's certainly an area where we need to focus on, and we need to better understand. And so as we get into this and we give you these results, we'll find out just exactly how we're shaking out today. And I think you might be able to anticipate what the next question might be, because of course this question is asking what is your plans for your home network, and we'll end up ultimately seeing, you know, hopefully what's happening for roaming in the next question. So as we're waiting for these results to come up, give some thought to your answer to the next question and how you're considering roaming. I think we should have these results up here in just a second, which always provides an insight into what this team is considering. Okay, so it looks like 10% of the attendees have already launched. 12% are going in the next 6 months. 6 to 12 months, there are 6%, 12 months and beyond, 7%, and undecided is at 8%. So the vast majority have either launched or are launching in the next 6 months, which really does give some sense of, you know, the momentum that's gathered here. So let's go to the next slide and talk about this in terms of roaming. If you're planning to launch LTE VoLTE roaming, what's your timeline? And so you'll see the poll come up here and give you the opportunity to ask that question. As we saw in the deployment of 3G and the evolution of that, the way in which any of these new technologies come about, we're always constantly looking to see the evolution from what's happening in the home market and the prioritization of that, and how does that get translated into the roaming market. I think the one difference, and this is certainly one of the themes that you'll hear in our conversation today with these experts, is the difference in the way in which the roaming market is really being considered today. We're looking at a roaming revenue stream, by and large, that has been compressed more so than it ever has in its history over the last 2 to 3 years. It's on a downward trend on the top line from a revenue point of view, and certainly some of the actions on a regulatory perspective are going to have an impact, and we'll certainly talk about that here in a little while. But because of the competitive nature of roaming, I think what we will see is an acceleration of VoLTE roaming services that is faster than what was implemented certainly for 3G. And a lot of that has to do with the competitive angle that roaming has now become, as well as the fact that we're really talking about a consumer base that has a level of expectation that has really never been seen before, and what the services are going to be. So as we talk more today to our experts about how and what are these challenges of launching VoLTE and launching VoLTE roaming, we will hear about, you know, what it really takes. So very interesting, the respondents have, this is really skewing to a little bit later. So 1% is saying they haven't launched home network yet. So 7% are saying next 6 months for VoLTE roaming. 2% are saying 6 to 12 months after that. Then you have 11% that are saying 12 months or beyond, and 12% are at undecided. So I think this is a great example of, this is a further down the road than what's happening at home, and but yet it is still on the radar. So let's continue, and let's get to our experts here. We are really, really pleased to have Keith Geyer join us today. Keith founded the Mobile Network in 2013, introducing a new voice to the media covering mobile network technology, and he has over 17 years of experience covering the mobile network ecosystem as a journalist and an editor. Through a variety of channels, the mobile network specializes in understanding and making sense of this technology that operators have to plan and design and optimize and monetize. So Keith has tracked the development of this VoLTE ecosystem since its beginnings, covering the technology development in the core and IMS, and the associated challenges with the service assurance and management. So we're going to really look to Keith to give us, what are the challenges that need to be overcome in launching VoLTE and certainly in the context of VoLTE roaming. And then we're really fortunate to have one of my peers in Syniverse, John Wick, Senior Vice President for the line of business responsible for the network services of Syniverse. John joined Syniverse in 1993, and it's really critical. One of the things about John is that he's not just a critical leader in the organization. He also knows as much about these networks as some of the folks in his technical teams. So because of that position, we have a wealth of information here about how in which the evolution of the networks have changed, and John's really going to have a great sense of what our customers have gone through over the last couple of years as they launched LTE and as they're planning to talk about and launch VoLTE roaming. So what I want to do now is hand it over to Keith, and Keith can get rolling on what do we have, what are we facing here in terms of VoLTE roaming and VoLTE challenges. Keith, I'll hand it over.
That's perfect. Thanks very much, Mary. Well, yes, great to speak to you all, everyone. Thanks for joining the call today. And thanks for those of you that took the time to vote there. There's some quite interesting results in that poll, which I think we'll come back to. Mary's given us a great start to the topic there. And I'd like to start with the traditional but still sincere thanks to Syniverse just for inviting me to talk today and give me the opportunity. What I'm going to do is share some of the conversations that I've been having over the last 18 months to 2 years with operators and their suppliers about VoLTE deployments. A little bit about how I've been doing that is through the mobile network. What we try and do, as it says there, is to make sense of what operators are doing with their mobile network technology, how they're thinking about deploying it, using it, and we push that out through a number of different outputs. You can see there in magazines, but also online in special reports and papers for people. And so to do that, it really means we actually spend quite a lot of time with the operators and the suppliers, trying to understand what their technical and service strategies are. And I have to say that, since we started as the mobile network coming up 3 years ago now, VoLTE has always been one of the dominant topics in that time. And I think, that's really because it touches on some really critical elements for operators. I mean, for sure, it's been about that technical transformation that they've had to do back in the IMS and the core. It's also because it's just such a critical service. It's a core revenue service for them. And it touches completely directly on customer experience, and it's something that operators just cannot afford to break. Voice is so critical to them. So it's business and technical transformation. It's a critical service. And it's really sort of shone a light on a lot of their own network operations. So if we move on, as I said, what I'm trying to do is just give a view of how operators are thinking about and communicating around VoLTE to start with, and then move that onto VoLTE roaming. And as I say, these are based on the conversations I've been having. And certainly through those conversations, one thing that I'm sure of, and it's something I certainly agree with the thrust of Mary's presentation there, is that, we're only going to see more of VoLTE. We're clearly in a ramp-up phase there. The operators I speak to, they are completely committed to this. And I think even if you look at that poll result today from those of you that voted, there was quite a high jump for, okay, we're going as early as we can here, and only a few pushing that out beyond the year. But I think also it's worth recognizing that VoLTE's not always been an easy path for operators to travel. And so my view here is that I think to understand where we might look forward to VoLTE roaming, maybe we need to understand a little bit about operators' experiences of VoLTE itself in the home network. And it's a little bit like to understand the future, we must first understand the past, and as we know in mobile, the past stays with us, it's not a foreign country. So with that, let's go on to the next slide, and we'll just recap a little bit. And acknowledge here that actually this has not been easy for operators. And that quote at the top there, that's a direct quote from a well-known operator. I must say it's not Verizon, although we have got the Verizon logo there. I'll come to that. But this is a tier 1 operator. They've got several million LTE subscribers. So they were doing the full complex iteration here of the IMS implementation. I think they said something like 17 new systems that required 74 new interfaces to configure and understand across. So that this was not a small service they were spinning up, but it's also worth pointing out they were involved themselves, this company, in writing the specifications in the standards bodies. So they weren't ingenues to this. They knew what they were getting into, but still the most complex thing I've ever worked on in 20 years. And just a couple of other points to back up that it's not been easy. Perhaps we'll see that the GSMA, for instance, issued a sort of a how-to guide based on the specs, and that's quite unusual. They felt the need to put a paper together to push out to the industry to say, look, this is how you do it, to try and demystify what looked to be quite complicated technology. And then from a customer-facing point of view, coming to this Verizon thing here, what this is then, this is a flyer that Verizon sent out to its sort of enterprise and business customers when it first enabled VoLTE, which they called advanced calling here. And essentially this flyer says, listen, this is a launch service and it may not work very well. And if it doesn't, this is how you can turn off LTE voice and just go back to circuit switch. So I think that's an indication that even when at a sort of an early launch stage, these things weren't easy. And if we just click down the next few points, we'll go through some of the things that operators have had to do to assure the launch. And as I said, this has been a technology that's really shone a light on, onto the network for operators and exposed a few things within the network. So just to run through one or two of these here, one thing that VoLTE's done is it's really highlighted the fact that although it's obviously we tend to think of it in terms of what's required in the core and the back end, perhaps, it's really shone a light on the radio network. And I think operators perhaps been slightly taken aback by how much optimization, by which I mean making sure that you're keeping users in LTE coverage as much as you can, really, how much optimization of the radio network they've required so that they're limiting those handovers and those fallbacks to 3G. And obviously the benefit of that is, one, the customers get a better experience, and two, you're just getting a lot less signaling flows through the network to deal with. So that's been one thing. And then the other thing, as I say, they've then needed to take an end-to-end network view, which is what I mean by that second point there. They've actually had to understand across the service where there might be issues. And that's right from, so their core networks, IMS, what's happening in the radio, and that goes out to the customer as well. So correlating that kind of information with knowledge about what customers are affected. These are often high-value customers, early adopters. They've got good phones. They're on LTE contracts to start with. These are not customers you really want to be messing with in terms of their experience. So that's required investment in quite often new methodology, new probes, new software to do that. Similarly, the same in how they sort of test and verify the service quality, some new scoring metrics around voice quality, because the underlying causes of what causes problems might be different. So the operators have been used to look at, a bunch of green lights and they know that the voice will be working well. But when it's a data service, that's a different thing. There's more variables at play there. As I've mentioned before, with the example at the top there, requiring a full IMS implementation, it's worth pointing out perhaps that one of the reasons it's been a bit of a trial for operators is that I think when the specs were written, there was an assumption that the IMS would be in place, and actually that's not been the case. A lot of the time, the people putting the VoLTE service out are kind of the pathfinders for IMS, because voice came down to being the financial justification for the IMS. So actually, as well as putting this new service in, they're having to put in the underlying platform for the service. Again, with VoLTE, obviously what we're doing here is, although we're charging customers on a per minute basis, these are not minutes essentially, they're packets, right? So we're having to do some billing mediation to the BSS systems to do a sort of as per minute billing to people. So there's been that integration to take care of. And on devices, what I mean here is obviously operators have had to choose which devices to go launch with. The devices themselves perform differently across the network. Operators might have to decide whether they want to do SRVCC, which is the single radio voice call continuity. So keeping continuity of calls, call control when a user is in LTE or not in LTE coverage. There might be a decision around how we're going to do voice over Wi-Fi, which we'll maybe come to a little bit later. Do that natively, or do it as a separate app to add on. And as I say, there's been a little bit of education to consumers to take care of as well. So that's been a fairly long list of elements operators have had to deal with just to get to this point. And if we move through, this then answers, well, why? Why go through that, really? And, this is another quote at the top. That's a real quote that comes from some research that an operator did in-house, if you like, on its own users. On a live network, I can share another stat. SK Telecom, obviously one of the pioneers in this technology, just this year did a survey, and they found they had a 76% approval rating for the overall quality and service quality. And the things that their customers like are on the right there, their own survey. And then the list on the left is really the kind of what operators have been telling me they see their customers like. And the two correlate pretty much. I mean, just to take call quality, for instance, I mean, it's HD codec, obviously. You don't have to run VoLTE to run an HD codec, let's be fair about that, but it sure helps. And certainly this has been the element with which operators feel the most confident in differentiating VoLTE. Why VoLTE from circuit switch voice is the great quality on that voice call. Setup time is one that some people like, some people are more ambivalent about, but certainly it's, if you hate waiting for calls to set up, this is super quick. In fact, some people think almost too quick. It can spook some people. I think we've almost got conditioned to expecting that sort of 3-4 second setup time on a call. Perhaps you use it to actually think about what you're going to say. That disappears, but it's very, very quick, and it is a different experience, let's put it that way. And then maybe just touch on, I put service richness question mark. SK Telecom actually listed at video quality. At the moment, those two are probably the same thing in the sense that going beyond voice, we're seeing video calling being pretty useful for people so far, people who have that enabled at least. So it's too early to say a customer benefit for other service richness, but clearly the point is of the underlying platform to enable more of that from a customer point of view. And then if we move on, we'll see that alongside these customer benefits, there are some more sort of hidden benefits for operators. Why, to answer that, why do VoLTE if it's this difficult? These are some of the other reasons to why do it. Obviously, we're looking in the long term, refarming the spectrum that you're currently using for 2G services or perhaps 3G services. Operators have different views on which will go first there. But there's that turn off there. We're also looking at just more efficient use of your existing spectrum. I mean, one of the things that comes up is that as more users get onto good smartphones, you don't actually want those smartphones to be camped out on your 2G network because often they don't work as well. They're less sensitive to the 2G bands. They require more signal to noise ratio. So you actually end up investing more in your 2G network to serve voice to people with LTE phones. It doesn't really make any sense. So there's a benefit in getting people onto voice over LTE and enabling that. You're not investing twice in your network. There's a benefit, as I mentioned, in signaling efficiency around that. And as I say, there's that potential for new services. Once you've got that, if you're going for the sort of the traditional full IMS implementation, there's a potential, and that people have different views on that, but there's a potential for some service richness. Video is certainly one. There may be other things such as file sharing, messaging, but we'll see. And then the final one's probably pretty important. Now you've got that infrastructure, you can enable that voice over Wi-Fi, and actually we're seeing, certainly I think in some markets, the UK as well, we're seeing voice over Wi-Fi almost be the pathfinder for VoLTE because it's a more controllable environment for operators, but also it's a nice message for them. They can extend their coverage, if you like, virtually into areas where they may not have great network coverage, indoors or in locations where the coverage isn't great. If you can get the same core control through the client on the phone or voice over Wi-Fi, then why not? So there's another operator benefit. Given that, then, if we have a look onto the next slide, you might think, okay, well, let's have a look at this and say, well, okay, we looked at how Mary portrayed that. First, we see the LTE launches. There are lots of those. Then we see voice over LTE launches, and there are fewer of those, but we see good reasons, despite some hardships, we see good reasons for those to happen. So then the third thing you'd expect to see is that natural extension to roaming, just as we've seen with LTE roaming itself eventually get there. And actually, I think we're seeing that less of that direct linear relationship so far. We've got these 3 announced roaming relationships so far, and it's not a lot. And even if you say, okay, well, there's only 30 operators, it's still not a lot in my view so far. And so you sort of think, well, why? What's the reason? I mean, I don't think it's a lack of will. What this timeline here shows is some research that Ovum did at the start of this year. and you're looking at those pink boxes, and you'll see that, you know, there's around, what, say 80% of the operators polled here expect that they would, within 2 years of VoLTE, they'd have roaming, and actually most of them are further to the left. Most of them are going 6 months, to 18 months there. So I don't think it's willpower. I think there is a will to do it, and if we move on, we'll probably see why that is. If we have a look at the next slide, perhaps. Yeah, so these are reasons for that good sentiment, if you like. You know, why do it anyway? I mean, this is a cool question, I guess, is well, you know, why enable it? I mean, at the moment, customers go abroad, they can make calls work okay, 2G, 3G, doesn't really matter. Why are we actually interested in enabling VoLTE roaming at this point? And I think, you know, the absolute key here is the same as why do VoLTE. You know, you've got these high value customers. You want to give them the best access you can to the best services you can. You know, to differentiate yourself, yes, or even if it's to keep up, just to play catch up and keep up in the market. So it's keeping that continuity of access to high quality calls there. The second point is related. If you don't do it, you don't provide it, maybe customers will find a different way to make their calls. Well, I think we're all fairly used to maybe looking for some Wi-Fi and Skyping there. And then as a customer, we're kind of lost to the operator, certainly in terms of sort of any kind of loyalty. So keeping customers on brand there. And then in the longer term, I think we're looking at the fact that either in the network your customers are going to, or in the home network, you're seeing that, you know, there may be some spectrum switch off. So you're looking at VoLTE as the long-term interoperability for voice. You know, nothing else is going to perhaps provide that in 5, 10 years from now. So those are the reasons to do it. So, you know, it's not about willpower. It's not about lack of reasons for this slight uncertainty around roaming. So is it technical? And let's just have a little look at what's happening on the technical side. Is it that it's difficult to do? And on the next slide, we'll see here. We'll see that, you know, there have been a couple of proposed architectural approaches to how to set up VoLTE roaming. The first would have been this Ravel, which really, it's roaming architecture for voice over IMS with local breakout. So if you can unpack that a little bit, it's local breakout, keeping the calls local, but there's still some signaling going back to the home network happening there. Now, John's going to go into a bit more deeper around these, so I'll scoot over these, but I just wanted to point out that, you know, that connection between the IMS to IMS elements from the home and visited network, you know, some people thought that was pretty difficult and it had some commercial issues with it as well. And so we've also seen the industry talk about S8 home routing or routing here. The S8 is the interface between the visited and home core networks, between the gateways on the visited and home networks, and what that's doing is mirroring perhaps a routing architecture we're more comfortable with, which is sending the media and the signaling back home where we're dealing with it, deciding what to do with it at home. But there are issues there as well. There's actually some lack of feature support. So we're not looking at SRVCC support. So you're not going to be able to keep control of calls. If you've got an outbound roamer who starts in an LTE network and moves, you can't keep control of that. There's some emergency number and legal intercept issues there as well. And finally, just this quote from the India Times. Perhaps there's still some people worried about, you know, how we're going to do this commercially. You know, setting up all the roaming agreements, which is obviously relevant to the IPX discussion with Syniverse. So I just want to wrap this up a little bit and just put that all in place and say, you know, my research has shown that operators yet to launch, you know, they're currently all out to get VoLTE done, right? Then when they launch, there's a lot of emphasis on the optimization of the insurance to ensure the experience is good. And roaming at that point is really down the path. You know, I think people are fully aware that there are discussions ongoing. They're looking at how the leaders are adopting the technology. So to put that simply, you know, it's not yet, and I stress the yet, a priority for those in the midst of rollouts. But it really quickly becomes one afterwards, and that's the important point. We've seen that over in research there. We've seen the poll actually today, that once you've got the VoLTE, you start to look for that as a priority because you're going to start to quickly think, hold on, why can't we provide this same service to our customers when they travel, especially as they're valuable customers to us? So that's where I come back to listing out the reasons for the issues perhaps we've had getting to this point with VoLTE, is that when it comes to roaming, the technical teams, they can't go through something like this again to enable roaming. You know, it's been a bit of a slog for some of them once. Roaming needs to be something that happens much more easily from a technical point of view. And so these questions remain really. One is, you know, is the technical architecture efficient for us? How should we do it? And the other one is really around when do we go? You know, do we go early, or do we wait until the, you know, there's lots of other operators to connect with? What are our advantages in doing either there? And so these are still our questions. And with that, and with some of the answers to these questions, I would now like to hand back to Mary to take us to the next phase of the webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Keith, thanks so much. That was fabulous. And it's just such a perfect setup, because these are the questions that we are consistently hearing as well, and they're really fundamental. So I want to hand it over to John Wick to take it from here. But before I do, I want to thank you guys. You're asking questions. Keep sending them in. We're going to try to make sure that we get to as many of them as we can. But with that, John, go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Keith, for walking us through the materials that you had. Fascinating stuff. It's really good to highlight the key values that come with enabling an IMS VoLTE environment between carrier networks. You know, certainly call setup, HD voice, video, and I think, you know, you touched on Wi-Fi calling a little bit within your material, and you know, as recently as this week, there was a larger wireless carrier within the United States that has launched Wi-Fi calling this week, and they're also very well along with VoLTE and LTE. So just 2 days ago, I was able to enable Wi-Fi calling on my Galaxy S6 that also does VoLTE calling and LTE. So there's a lot of values and services that come with enabling this, and it certainly makes sense to expand that to your global business partners that you roam with at the same time. So today we're going to dive into VoLTE roaming and some of the things that we've learned as we've been progressing with our carrier customers to get things deployed. I thought the first thing I would do, though, is establish a bit of a baseline on some VoLTE use cases that are kind of the prominent ones. And what I mean by that is that there's what we call VoLTE interconnect, which you see on the top half of the chart, and then VoLTE roaming on the bottom half of the chart. So briefly on VoLTE interconnect, what will happen over time as VoLTE becomes more widely deployed, the basic use cases of making a voice call, for example, an international voice call, if you think about how that works today, that call going from handset A to handset B, it might go through 4, 5, 6 or more different international long-distance carriers before the two end users get connected. The model that is available when both sides deploy VoLTE IMS is that they can now do those use cases directly over 1 or 2 IPX networks. And it's not just a voice call, it's also a video call, it's a Wi-Fi call, it's a media session. So all these things that are now possible because you've got IMS VoLTE deployed on your core network. So that's VoLTE interconnect, and that's going to happen over time, and we'll see how that progresses. But the international calling environment that we all know and understand today is potentially poised for a change as a result of VoLTE interconnect. VoLTE roaming, as with any roaming, somebody from mobile network operator A travels to mobile network operator B, and they expect to be able to use the services, whether it's voice messaging or data, that they're able to use when they're home. So we're going to talk about how is that possible with VoLTE. We all know how it works with 3G. We've probably been involved in some form of making it work with LTE data. And now we're talking about, okay, well, what does VoLTE mean? And it's easy to confuse LTE data with VoLTE, and hopefully we're going to clear that up for you guys today. Let's go to the next chart. So Keith mentioned the scenario that's called home-based routing, or S8HR. So the diagram on the chart, if you look at the top left, that's the VPMN, or the serving market. That's the network that is roamed into. Following to the right, you see an orange box called IPX, and within the IPX, you've got some diameter serving capabilities. And on the right side, you've got the home network, which is where you're from. And you can see from the drawing that the home network has deployed an IMS core network. The served network has not. So in this scenario, The serving network and the home network do have a relationship to support LTE data roaming. That same relationship is leveraged to enable VoLTE services for the roamer. The way that's accomplished is the connection for the roamer is tunneled back to the home network. So the same path that you would use for LTE data roaming is leveraged to get that subscriber to the home IMS core network. And as you can see, if you follow the drawing to the right and then down, we drop down into the IPX again, and then we get to what's called the B party. So if the A party on the left of the drawing is trying to do some form of interaction with the B party, and that is a use case that fits into VoLTE or IMS, this is the flow that it would take. Now the advantages here, so it's faster to deploy than local breakout. We'll talk about local breakout in a minute, but it uses the same GTP tunnel that's used for LTE data roaming. And as you all know, and as Mary mentioned earlier, LTE data roaming has been getting a lot of attention over the last 3 years, and there is a lot of real production commercial LTE roaming activity happening on a global basis. Those same paths can be used to support S8 home routing. So it utilizes the same components that are already in the evolved packet core. So the VPMN doesn't have that, but the home does. Those get leveraged by connecting to the home network over that GTP tunnel. You can use the same data IoT charges with your roaming partners. So not a lot of work to be done on the roaming agreements, which I'm sure is making a lot of people happy on the call. And use existing TAP and RIX with only minor changes. So those are the advantages. So we've got speed, we've got being able to give the IMS core services to your user without having an IMS core network on both sides. We've got relative seamlessness with regard to the roaming agreements, and then being able to leverage some existing TAP and RIX capabilities. Challenges. So the challenges, because all of the calling activity is being tunneled to the home network, which, by the way, is different than how it works today with 3G. Lawful intercept, emergency calling, and voice call continuity can be complex. So voice call continuity, what do we mean by that? If you establish a data session, a call, or a video session, for example, on VoLTE, and you're moving, and you move off of that network onto a 3G signal, there's probably going to be issues with handoff. Emergency calling. So if you're traveling internationally and you're on a different continent and you try to conduct an emergency call, those dialed digits are going to get sent to your home network. Your home network's probably not going to know what to do with those digits. And then lawful intercept can be complex as well for different regulatory and geographical basis regions. But these are things that we've seen that can be challenging with S8 home routing. Even though it's fast to deploy and get up and running, there are some complexities. Service visibility for the VPMN. So because everything you do is being tunneled to the home network, there's not a lot of visibility for the serving network beyond knowing what access point name or APN is being used. And other than that, the VPMN primarily just sees data packets in terms of megabyte consumption and signaling. Signaling, which brings me to the situation with SMS. So SMS is now being enabled via signaling. No longer an SO7 transaction that we all know very well. It's now collapsed down to the SIP diameter signaling streams, primarily SIP. So this is something that you need to think about if you're used to having visibility to SMS transactions at a very discrete basis. That some things are going to have to change to make that possible now. And then retail billing based on TAP. So because all of the things that your roamer is doing is being exchanged in terms of megabytes. So whether they're making a voice call or a video session or doing messaging, it still looks like megabytes at the end of the day. You have to determine, how do I extract those megabytes into buckets of, was this a call, this was a video, this was a session, this was a file share? Can I do that using QCI values? Can I do that using APNs? And do I get CDRs off of my IMS core network that allow me to do that? Ultimately, to create a suitable version of a TAP record that can then be used to facilitate retail billing. So there's a lot of correlation and aggregation that has to occur to be able to do what we're used to being able to do with 3G networks. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is local breakout. Local breakout means that the serving network and the home network both have an evolved packet core IMS deployed. And you can see through the drawing that the VPMN A-party side of the drawing has changed a bit. So we've now got the box called the EPC, we've got CSCS, IBCF, things that didn't exist on the previous drawing. And what this means is we've now got a serving network and a home network that can actually communicate with each other at the IMS level. You still have diameter flowing between the two networks, as shown by the DRA box and the IPX in between. And then you've got IMS Exchange. IMS Exchange is a platform that is there for a number of reasons. And one is to address the interoperability issues between S8 home routing and local breakout. Another is to think about dialed number correction, think about VoLTE to Wi-Fi handover, think about call routing optimization, call routing whitelist and blacklist, and then special routing. So this is a platform that has evolved and needs to exist in between the roaming networks, as there has always been the case, whether it was 2G, 3G. There's always been some degree of interworking and interoperability that surfaced that needed to be addressed by someone. That logically happens inside of the IPX world today, and I see that continuing. So the advantages. So you've now got session awareness in the served network. The served network now has a good view of what's happening with that user. They're not simply backhauling all the traffic to the home network and not really sure what's happening other than exchanging megabytes of data. You've got visibility into the control and the media plane of a call or a video session taking place. If you need to treat the data differently because it's a call versus a video session, maybe a video session needs a higher priority so that those packets get through faster, you can do that. You've now got the ability to actually offer lawful intercept and emergency call handling. The served network is now involved intimately in the dialed digits and satisfying the use case. So independent of geography, the digits that are dialed will probably be processed correctly. Here's a big one. You've got continuity of voice call between LTE and circuit switch. So we're going to have circuit switch networks coexisting for a long time. So handoff between those is important. With local breakout, that happens and it works well. Support for a billing model. So you're now back to a point where TAP is a viable option for retail billing. What are the challenges? It's complex. As Keith said, it's highly complex just getting the home network to work. Now you have to think about, how do I make that same situation work with my favorite business partner that's 10,000 miles away on another continent? So that's really what you're faced with here, and that's what we've actually been dealing with, and why we're presenting this to you guys today and sharing the information. The IMS interoperability challenges with LDOs, different vendors, different implementations. That's always the case. I don't see that ever changing. Multiple feeds from many network elements for the serve and the home network. So this is a new environment, and with that comes new interfaces and new feeds and new records. And then, the local breakout for VoLTE with S8 home routing for data adds complexity. So what do we mean by that? That means that there's a version here where the voice calls can be handled via local breakout, but the data, in other words, accessing the internet or whatever it is you're doing, can still go over the same path that LTE data does. So you've now got a hybrid model in place, and that adds more complexity. And then there's new TAP record types. There's a new field or a new value for mobile session and a new value for messaging event that are unused and that are going to evolve into the system over time. So let's go to the next chart. So Mary talked about a few of the milestones and major achievements with VoLTE roaming. First transoceanic VoLTE roaming call, establishing VoLTE roaming between South Korea and Japan, and launching the first commercial VoLTE roaming service. So we've been very fortunate to be involved in all of these, and it's exciting for us, but we've also learned a lot, and we want to share that with you. So if we go to the next chart, we're going to talk about some of the things that happened with these major events. So we found that connection setup and call quality are actually better than 3G. So even though we're backhauling from Asia to North America, for example, we still found the time to set up the call, to get the connection, and get the session going was better than 3G. And that applied to voice calls and video sessions, so we were very pleased to see that result. The real-time control of voice traffic eliminates the need for CAML and helps control fraud. So you don't need to worry about CAML now. You've got the ability to control those services without having to think about how do I make sure that my deployment of CAML matches my roaming partner's deployment of CAML. We found out that the handsets do not default to VoLTE for roaming. So this is an important one to understand because it can cause a lot of time to be spent in testing trying to figure out why things aren't working. So you need to make sure that you ask the question to your handset vendor to ensure that you've got handsets that are going to appropriately latch on to VoLTE when roaming. The assumption was that the home operator would support lawful intercept. So if you think about the S8 home routing model, you've got one of your roamers is in Asia and your network is in England. You can't assume that that serving network in Asia is going to be able to satisfy the demands of lawful intercept that you may have to comply to. So it's something you need to think about and be aware of the complexities that may exist with that. And then there's charging. Charging for VoLTE, it just simply needs to be worked out between you and your business partners. And give an example here where some operators charge LTE data IoT rates for VoLTE. And if operators prefer a different IoT, then you simply need to tell them, okay, how do I determine that? Do I use APN? Do I use QCI, which is Quality Connection Indicator? There's a couple of ways to do it. It's just something that you need to spend some time in advance thinking about. And if you do, things will go a lot smoother when you do start to deploy these roaming agreements. Go to the next chart. So operators must understand how their roaming partners support S8 home routing. So again, back to the QCI point, this is a pretty critical point because it can involve having to go into your core network and make changes potentially. But we found where QCI with one carrier and QCI with the other carrier, both of which want to roam, were different. And now there are cases where the IPX, again, sitting in the middle, can adapt this and normalize it. But the option also exists for you to do it yourself between you and your business partner. What's the maximum bit rate for each QCI? And again, back to normalizing between you and your partner, how do you guys deploy QCI and apply it? And then what are the number of APNs and which APNs are supported per QCI? So hopefully you're starting to see that QCI and APN are very critical to making these things work correctly. We found that video calls started during voice calls were difficult to distinguish by the VPMN. So if you recall 2 slides back where I said, you know, in the S8 home routing model, it looks like packets of data. It's megabytes. So again, you need to think about how will I know an APN or a video session versus a call session? And again, the QCI and APN are key to that. And then I mentioned before that SMS is viewed as signaling. And you know, typically signaling is something that you do between yourself and your roaming partner, and it's not a financial component. Something that you may need to think about because now that you know, there's some exposure here that you know messaging could be exposed to spam, and you know potentially there are commercial ways to get that under control, and we've touched on a little bit of that with what we've done already with our VoLTE trialing and commercial launches. But it's something you need to be aware of. The nature of SMS changes quite a bit with VoLTE. Go to the next slide. I think that's it. So thank you for giving me some time to walk you through that. I think now I'm going to turn it back over to Mary to lead us through some Q&A.
We've got some great questions. Thanks, John, for that. I think there's such a depth of information here that I'm going to jump into these really quickly so that we can get to as many as we can. First one is a bit long, so the way I'll do it is I'm going to start this one with you, John, and then I'll round robin, and the next question I'll start and hand over to you, Keith, and then give you both the chance to chime in on each other's responses. So let's go ahead and start with the first one. So the first question is, how successful do you think VoLTE domestic services are today? Does the customer really appreciate the difference? I mean, with, you know, when you consider the impact of, say, an NPS score or ARPU, or is the key driver still the benefits you get from the technical point of view? So I think this is a great consumer versus how does the consumer feel about it versus, where is really, is it a technical driver to do and deploy VoLTE domestic services? So John, you want to start with that one?
Absolutely, that's a great question. The way I would answer it is both sides of that question score very high from my perspective. So the carrier that deploys VoLTE IMS, they get a lot of benefit from spectrum reuse and capacity, but the benefit to the consumer is substantial. And I can personally vouch for HD voice is very high quality, and as Keith said, you don't have to do VoLTE to do HD voice, but it certainly gives the end user a very good experience. I mean, it almost to the extent that you have to check and see if the speaker was accidentally turned on your phone. The quality is so clear. Call setup, as Keith mentioned, it's unbelievable. I mean, there's almost a race condition that occurs with call setup where you are already hearing the person you're calling talking, and the ring still hasn't finished yet. So it's pretty impressive. And that's just the services, So being able to offer VoLTE calling, HD voice, video, simply hitting the green button and having a video call, and then, oh, by the way, here's Wi-Fi calling. And, all of these things are happening on that same device that's VoLTE capable. So from my perspective, score high on the consumer side and score high on the carrier side. Steve?
Yeah, please go ahead, Keith. You want to chime in?
Yeah. Sure, yeah. So, I mean, look, my view on this is, I probably was reasonably skeptical about, are there really that many differences? I think the research from the operators is showing that there are. I do not know the answer to Net Promoter Score versus circuit switch voice. I suspect it's just a bit early for those metrics, but I do know that in tests and trials, it comes out really well. And the other thing I know is it isn't just a question of VoLTE versus, on-network circuit switch voice. I think we also need to be aware, lots of people use other services for voice, Skype, Viber, whatever, and it's, WhatsApp, it's much better than those. It just is set up in the network to work better. It's got, the dedicated bearer. So it's not just, is it better than 2G, 3G voice? Is it better than the wider competitive environment, and it is there. I don't think one, is it more about technical back-end benefits? I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. Bit of a cheesy answer, but I think I think that's genuine, really. But that is the core question, isn't it? Are there real consumer benefits around it? And the short answer there, I think, is yes.
All right. I'm interested in the answer to this next question, and I'm going to start with you, Keith. It is, do you see a risk of fragmentation across industry, considering that we have two options available, and most operators wouldn't invest on both? So it's definitely the S8 versus S8 home routing versus local breakout. So I'm interested in your feedback here, and John, I'm going to give this. And if you guys could kind of keep your questions a little brief, because I want to see how many we can get through these. Go for it.
All right. The short answer to that is you'd think so, but no, because there is the potential within the IPX environment, and to be fair, it doesn't have to be Syniverse, but there is the potential to link an operator who's running one with another, as I understand it. So, John, you may want to chime in there if I'm wrong here, but that's my understanding of it.
No, Keith, you're right, and I think that situation will always exist, and I think it's a commercially driven question in some cases where, the scale of the volume of traffic between one partner and another may drive a decision to do that. And it does work, absolutely. And, that situation will always exist, but I think there's a substantial demand for, the roaming model as well without doing those direct connections. But, yeah, you're right, Keith. It's not a technical complexity, but
Sure, and I think the question was also asking, if a bunch of operators go and do one thing, and another bunch go and do another, so we're talking local breakout or S8 home routing, is that going to create some kind of, schism, or they won't be able to interoperate? And what I'm saying is, no, as I understand it, no, it won't. So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, there might be some.
So,
those will be addressed.
go ahead, John. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yep.
So listen, let me get this last. Let's see. I think we can get this one and maybe one more done. And so this is an interesting question. We heard from a carrier in the last LTE summit in Amsterdam that VoLTE is the answer against the OTT threat. Do you agree with that? I think I want to start with Keith on this, actually, and then John, if you want to chime in.
Well, this is the, this is the big question. Do I agree with that? I think I don't necessarily agree with OTT threat, right, as a term, but I get where it's coming from. I think what that carrier might have been saying is that it gives them a platform with which to perhaps launch other services. I think I wasn't there for that talk, so if you view it like that, then I'm less positive on that, because I'm sort of not fully convinced of the ability of carriers to really innovate on those kinds of platforms to compete with, some of the names we've mentioned so far. But certainly from a voice point of view, as I said earlier, I think it is. I think, the ease, the quality, the native experience on the handset, the control the operator has, there I'm much more positive.
Yeah, I agree. And, let's face it, at the end of the day, the operators have this one golden item, which is globally relevant phone numbers. And by moving to a VoLTE IMS environment, they've brought themselves, from a technological perspective, at a very high level to be able to deploy services that take them beyond what some of the OTTs are doing today. Certainly the voice apps, I mean, it's as simple as hitting the green button on your phone to use a carrier-provided VoLTE IMS service for voice or video. It's not that simple with a downloadable app over the top. And then, the whole approach of messaging, is, just takes the operators to a level where they can do a lot of things. And Keith kind of hit the nail on the head. It comes down to execution, but certainly the capacity is there to do something.
I can't tell you the kinds of questions that are coming in. We're getting everything from, the reemergence of RCS to unlawful intercept, as well as the use of the GRX path. Let me tell you what we're going to do here. I want to be very respectful for those folks of you that took the time to dial in today, that we will address all of these questions via blog post, which you will get a note stating when we're doing so. Further, we may actually even attempt to directly answer some of these questions individually. But I can't thank you all enough for such diligent follow-through. We will be sending along early next week a link to the recording of this, because I think there's just a great deal of depth, as well as the link to SlideShare with the slides that were shared today by John and Keith. Once again, thank you to John and Keith for such incredibly interesting information, and frankly, just the level of expertise and knowledge here that you were able to share. And thank you all so much for taking the time to attend today. We so appreciate this. We're going to really hope to continue this series into 2016. So be on the lookout for more on VoLTE roaming. And we so look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Thank you all very much, and happy holidays.